You already know something isn't right. You've seen how the system builds pressure. You've seen how cycles repeat. You've seen how everything keeps moving until it breaks. But here's the part most people still don't understand. Even when the system collapses, it doesn't actually reset the way you think it does. Because the crash isn't the end of the system. It's how the system continues. And once you understand that, you stop looking at crashes as failures and start seeing them as part of the design. That's why every cycle looks different but ends the same way. Expansion begins slowly, conditions improve, confidence builds, credit expands. People take on more risk, but it doesn't feel like risk because everything is still working. Prices rise, opportunities multiply. It feels like progress, like growth, like the system is finally moving in the right direction. But underneath that surface, something else is happening. Pressure is building. Not all at once, not in a way that's obvious, but steadily, quietly, in the background of everything people believe is normal. Debt increases, leverage expands, margins shrink. The system becomes more sensitive, more dependent on everything continuing exactly as it is. And that's where the real problem begins. Because once a system becomes dependent on perfect conditions, it becomes fragile. It may look strong, it may appear stable, but that stability is conditional. It only exists as long as nothing disrupts it. And eventually, something always does. A shift in policy, a change in interest rates, a slowdown in growth, a loss of confidence. It doesn't matter what triggers it. What matters is that once pressure reaches a certain point, the system no longer needs a major shock to break. It only needs a push. And when that push comes, everything that looked stable begins to move in the opposite direction. Prices fall, liquidity tightens, credit contracts, confidence disappears, and suddenly, what felt safe just months earlier becomes the source of risk. That's what people experience as a crash. But the crash itself is not the problem. The crash is the release. It's what happens when pressure that has been building for years can no longer be sustained. And this is where most people misunderstand what's really happening. They see the crash as failure. They see it as something that went wrong. They see it as an event that needs to be fixed. But in reality, the crash is what allows the system to continue. Because without the crash, the pressure would keep building until the entire structure becomes unsustainable. The reset is not an accident. It's a requirement. And once you understand that, everything starts to look different. You stop expecting stability to last forever. You stop assuming growth will continue without interruption. And you stop building your life around the idea that the system will always behave the way it does during good times. Because it won't. It never has. And it never will. This is why cycles repeat. Not because people forget, but because the structure itself encourages the same behavior over and over again. When conditions improve, people take on more risk. When risk increases, leverage expands. When leverage expands, pressure builds. And when pressure builds, the system moves toward another reset. It doesn't matter how advanced the system becomes. It doesn't matter how much regulation exists. It doesn't matter how much people try to control it. The cycle remains because the incentives remain, and incentives drive behavior more than anything else. That's why even when people know a crash is possible, they still participate in the buildup, because the system rewards them for doing so. It rewards growth. It rewards expansion. It rewards risk-taking during favorable conditions. And by the time those conditions change, most people are already too exposed to step back easily. That's what creates the pattern. Not ignorance, not stupidity, but structure. And once you see that, you stop blaming individuals for what is essentially a systemic process. You start focusing on something much more important: position. Because while the system moves through cycles, not everyone experiences those cycles the same way. Some people get hit harder. Some people recover faster. Some people even benefit. And the difference between those outcomes is not luck, it's positioning. Where you stand when conditions change determines how those changes affect you. If your position depends entirely on stability, then instability becomes a threat. If your position depends on constant growth, then contraction becomes a problem. If your position is built on leverage without control, then tightening conditions become dangerous. But if your position is built with awareness of the cycle itself, everything changes. You don't expect stability to last. You don't assume growth is permanent. You don't rely on conditions staying favorable. Instead, you prepare for movement. You prepare for change. You prepare for the moment when everything shifts. And that preparation doesn't happen at the peak. It happens long before that. Because by the time a crash is visible, it's already too late to reposition easily. Decisions become reactive instead of strategic. Pressure limits options. Time disappears. And most people are forced to protect what they have instead of positioning for what comes next. That's why understanding the system matters before it breaks. Because positioning is not something you can do effectively under pressure. It's something you build over time. And that brings us to one of the most important ideas in this entire system. The crash redistributes value. It doesn't destroy it completely. It moves it from weak positions to strong ones, from over-leveraged participants to those with control, from those forced to sell to those able to buy. That's what resets the system. Not elimination, but redistribution. And once you understand that, the question changes. It's no longer, how do I avoid the crash? It becomes, where am I positioned when it happens? Because avoiding the cycle is not realistic, but positioning within it is. And that's where leverage, assets, and control begin to matter more than anything else. Because during expansion, almost everything looks like a good decision. Assets rise. Opportunities increase. Confidence hides risk. But during contraction, the difference becomes clear. Only certain positions hold. Only certain structures survive. Only certain strategies continue to work. And those are the ones built with an understanding of the cycle itself. This is why the idea of playing the system differently matters. Not because you can control the cycle, but because you can control how exposed you are to it. You can control how dependent you are on favorable conditions. You can control how much flexibility you have when things change. And you can control whether you are forced to react or able to act. That distinction becomes everything during moments of stress. Because when pressure increases, people don't suddenly become irrational. They become constrained. Their options shrink. Their timelines shorten. Their decisions become driven by necessity instead of strategy. And that's what creates opportunity for those who are not under the same pressure. Because while others are trying to hold on, they are able to move forward. Not because they are smarter, but because they are positioned differently. That's the advantage. And it's built long before the moment it's needed. That's why the system rewards awareness over reaction. Because reaction happens too late. By the time something is obvious, it's already priced in. By the time something is visible, It's already affecting behavior. And by the time most people act, they are doing so under conditions they didn't prepare for. But awareness changes that. It allows you to see the buildup before the release. It allows you to recognize patterns instead of reacting to events. And it allows you to position yourself before pressure forces everyone else to move at the same time. That's the real shift. Not predicting the exact moment, but understanding the direction, understanding the structure, understanding what the system is moving toward, even when everything looks stable. Because stability is often the final stage before instability. And the longer stability lasts, the more pressure builds beneath it. That's what makes the system feel predictable until it isn't. And that's why most people are caught off guard. Not because they didn't see signs, but because they believed stability would continue. But once you understand the system, you don't rely on that assumption. You operate differently. You build differently. You think differently. And over time, that changes your position completely. Because instead of reacting to the system, you begin to move with it. You begin to use its structure instead of being shaped by it. And that's where the real advantage exists, not outside the system, but inside it, with clarity. Because once you see how it works, you stop being surprised by what happens next. And that alone puts you ahead of almost everyone else.